I have to ask about accents then. I'm told that I have a strong accent. I don't hear my accents myself. Now, when it comes to podcasting, does the tone of voice, your accent, how you deliver your words, does that all have an impact on the success of it? Can I be a hit in India, Gautam?
You can definitely be a hit in India. And unfortunately, if accents are what people judge podcasts on the basis of, then I'm screwed. Because I, I think when God was doling out accents to different parts of the world, I don't think he was too kind with the Indian accent. So so I really hope not. I truly hope that accents don't play a very large role. I think it's still part of your personality though. So if you got a specific accent and it's quirky, like own it. Uh, the last thing one needs is another generic sounding podcast. Goodness gracious.
Welcome to Coaching Conversations, the show where we dive into the inspiring stories of innovators, entrepreneurs, and change makers who are transforming industries and pushing the boundaries of what's possible. I'm your host, Coach Ellen Mai, and today's guest is Gautam, founder of Hubhopper, South Asia's largest podcasting platform. His mission is to transform the podcasting space, making it easy for creators to launch, distribute, and monetize their shows. His vision is to expand across emerging markets where podcasting is really taking off. He credits his success to the amazing podcasters and creators who've shaped Hubhopper's journey. Recognised by Fortune's 40 Under 40 in 2021 and Forbes 30 Under 30 in Asia in 2018. He's also received awards like Entrepreneur of the Year from Entrepreneur magazine and was part of YourStory's Tech 30 in 2019. Throughout his journey, he's had the chance to speak at places like Harvard Business School and Forbes Under 30 Global Summit in Berlin. Outside Hubhopper, he's passionate about nature, tech, spending time with his family and friends, and of course, listening to an unhealthy amount of podcasts. He's also committed to giving back, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, he was part of Mission Oxygen, an initiative that raised funds and imported life-saving equipment to address India's oxygen shortage. As someone who's new to podcasting, I want to find out what it truly takes to create a podcast that's both successful and authentic. Is there space for more podcasts? What do people enjoy listening to? And what are the do's and don'ts of successful podcasting? If you love podcasts, you're in for a treat, as Gautam is known as the Podfather and is a wealth of knowledge on the subject. So, let's dive into today's episode, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I do. Welcome to Coaching Conversations, Gautam, or should I just call you the Podfather from now on?
Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure and an honor, and thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. So I've introduced our listeners to you briefly, but I think it would be good to begin about this obsession that you have. And the obsession being podcasts, obviously, because this conversation is about podcasts. And the fact that you listen to up to 14 hours of podcasts per day. Tell me when and where and how all of this began, Gautam.
Okay, awesome. So it comes from crippling loneliness. No, I'm joking. It actually comes from when I was. It's a funny story. I was actually at my previous job. I used to work at a bank, and my job actually required me to spend a very large amount of time on my own. I was a risk and research analyst, so you couldn't find a more boring job title for somebody to choose. So I had to spend copious amounts of time on my own. And to add insult to injury, the corporate bank that I was at, they had put firewalls on all the regular websites that one would normally frequent. So this was back in 2014, and I couldn't access YouTube, I couldn't access Facebook, I couldn't even access platforms like Tumblr. So I was going a little stir crazy, as you might imagine, and very fortuitously, I stumbled upon podcasts, and it was quite interesting because it was a media format that I'd never heard of, and I wasn't alone in that. I can, with quite a lot of certainty, state that none of my friends had ever heard of podcasts, and um, um, pretty much 99% of the country hadn't heard, or 99.99% of the country hadn't heard of a podcast before. So I felt a little bit like Alice in Wonderland, because I felt like I had discovered something that nobody else had. And I started falling down this rabbit's hole of consuming content whilst at work, and I didn't know when it started to overrun and take over different parts of my life, because in the initial stages I was just consuming it during that 7 to 8 hour window, while I was in office, and I was consuming mostly ROI driven content that I could learn from, upskill from, etc. But um, I think it's a little bit like an addiction, because I started to replace my morning content consumption habits, like reading the newspaper, with audio. So I was consuming news unconsciously now via audio instead of reading the newspaper. On my drive to work, instead of listening to the radio, where I didn't have much control, or listening to music, which became repetitive, I started to listen to podcasts. On my At work, I was already listening to content. On my way back from work, I was listening to hobbyist related content. At night, I was living alone at the time, so I was listening to true crime while cooking, and then I would go to bed listening to ASMR, because I'm somebody that doesn't like listening in. I don't like sleeping in silence. So yeah, so before I knew it, I was consuming 14 hours of content a day, and this, I mean, was a pattern that I followed for about 4 or 5 years until I got married, and then I thought that that would actually make me stop consuming content at least at night. But the habit stuck. So now what I do is I put flat speakers in my pillowcase, and I actually go to bed listening to podcasts till this date, which is great fun. So yeah, that's pretty much how I fell into this medium to begin with.
So you're not alone there anymore, are you, Gautam? There's around about 550 million, am I correct, podcast listeners globally.
Mhm. There are, and I actually think that that number may even be underreported if you look at the larger umbrella term of podcasts, because it's very difficult in this day and age to actually circle in on exactly what somebody means when they say the word podcast. Are they talking about an RSS driven podcast? Are they talking about a YouTube podcast? Are they talking about an Instagram driven podcast? So the definition of the word skews this number quite a lot.
So I think that it's a good time for a question then is what is the actual definition of a podcast these days? Back in the day, I used to think that they used to be audio only, but you told me that a podcast actually started as something more visual. So what's the history of the podcast?
No, it's actually a really great question. So, if you go back to the early 2000s, they weren't even called podcasts. They used to be called audio blogs. And The terminology of podcasts came to sort of um, came to the fore when it was actually a marketing mogul that took the word iPod and took the word broadcast and then meshed the two together and came up with podcast, because Apple was one of the few companies that had adopted this media format. So essentially, what a podcast was at that time and for a very long time continued to be was um uh, basically a form of content that was pre recorded and that was hosted or resided in one environment but could be consumed in various different environments. So that's basically where a hosting platform came to be. So a hosting platform would act as the home of your podcast and the distributor of your podcast. And then whenever somebody was trying to play this podcast wherever it was, the person that would try playing the podcast would click the play button. A request would be made at the back end directly to the hosting platform. And in real time, the hosting platform would stream the podcast for lack of complexity in the listen side application. So, very simply put, there is listening platform A, let's call it listen.com. You click a particular podcast in listen.com. Listen.com makes a request to where this podcast is hosted. The hosting platform will send the podcast in real time and you can listen to it in listen.com. So that's pretty much how the podcasting space worked, and why broadcasting was such an imperative and important part, because a podcast would reside in one place but be consumed in various places. And it was fortuitous for Apple that Apple got very sort of closely aligned with the media format way back when. Now, this actually was bad for a couple of other types of companies, because companies like Microsoft as well had actually adopted podcasts very long ago, around the same time as Apple. So they had come out with a similar product called the Zune, and the Zune also had podcasts, and these podcasts were both visual and audio format. And it just so happens that because this term was coined, the company ran with it, and Apple got very closely associated with the media format. Um, Now, the secondary, I would say, negative aspect of this was wherever markets existed where Apple didn't have major penetration, where Apple products didn't have major penetration, people immediately believed that the media format was not for them. So, like for a market like India, where I'm from, this was a major problem statement, because when we came into the podcast market in 2015, Apple had about 1.5 to 2% of the market share in terms of smartphones. It's not like the West at all. So everybody had an Android, and so when even when we try to evangelize and talk about the word podcast, people shrugged it off because they believed that it was a media format that was meant for the elite 1%, because that's the branding that Apple has in emerging markets. And it was content that would never be correlated to, you know, I remember when we had just started Hubhopper, I used to go in Ubers, or I used to go in cabs, and I used to hear the cab driver would be listening to audio content, and then I would ask them if they've ever heard of a podcast, and they would get disgruntled and essentially tell me that this is media that's not meant for us. This media is meant for, you know, a certain demographic of society, and they continue listening to audio content. So it created a major divide, and that's why adoption took a very long time.
Wow, so there was a socio-economic aspect to it at that
A
point, then,
huge
and a
one,
pushback.
huge one.
That's incredibly interesting. But fast forward now to 2024, the three big players are still Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and now YouTube as well, aren't they? And in which order do those work? Because I know that there's about 6 million podcasts currently on Spotify, aren't there? Is it pretty similar on the other platforms?
Yeah, so that's again a really great question. So uh, First, let's talk about the 6 million. So the thing about a podcast is when they say that there are a certain number of podcasts that have existed, they are talking about podcasts that have existed from the dawn of time. So that means how many RSS feeds have been created in history. Now, those RSS feeds, 6 million may currently exist in the world, but that doesn't mean 6 million podcasts are active. In fact, the number of people that are actively creating podcasts right now, the number is much smaller than that, probably one tenth of that figure. So for a lot of people who think that this space is getting very populated and the competition is um, you know uh, not conducive to starting, they shouldn't think about that at all. This number that's being quoted is not being quoted from the perspective of the number of active shows that are out there. The second point that you mentioned was the consumption side platforms. YouTube, if you look at the broader umbrella term of podcasts, not RSS driven podcasts, YouTube has been one of the largest consumption avenues for podcasts since around 2018. So it's not a new phenomenon that people consume podcast type content on YouTube. YouTube recently just made a very small update in their platform where they changed a couple of labels, and they started to adopt podcast across YouTube Music and YouTube. But that doesn't mean that they changed something very you know significant technologically. Um, but what it basically did was branded the fact that they are adopting podcast to a very large degree. In the India market, Apple still isn't one of the largest players whatsoever. So you'll have platforms like Wink, Hangama, Geo7, Spotify, and you'll see these different platforms in rotation. A lot of them you've not heard of. So even from a podcaster's lens, when they're thinking about the distribution of their show, they need to think about consumption platforms that sit outside of the ones that they already know. Because if you're looking at a platform like Geo7, I'm just giving you a random example. Give a platform like um, Ghana or Geo7. These platforms have at some point or other had over a billion, had over 100 million monthly active users. So they have such so many users and so many people, but they have fewer number of podcasts that are available on them. So if you get your podcast into these platforms, which is not difficult to do, you stand the chance of seeing an uptick in your show's performance by not doing too much more. You're just leveraging more platforms than the obvious ones that come to your mind because you consume on them.
Wow. So, for someone like me who's new to podcasting, so I've done a few podcasts now and I started about 3 months ago. For me, I was thinking, no, the market's saturated, but I'm doing it because I love conversing with people like you. I'm a coach and I love learning and asking questions. So why not? Let's do it. So you're saying that if there's people listening today and they've got something that they really want to talk about on a podcast, that the world's their oyster in a way.
Yes, I would believe so, because if you even ask yourself outside of the interview related podcasts that you're aware of that are very popular, but they're also the easiest, I would say, lowest hanging fruit in terms of uh, how to start. Think about certain categories and ask yourself if you can name podcasts in those categories. Because if the market was saturated, then you should be able to name podcasts in each category and each subcategory. So if you can tell me the best parenting podcast in the UK right now, then that means that may be a space that's been sort of filled, or that's a space that already has a very significant name. However, if you can't, that means that space is still up for grabs. And this is something that I tell folks in the India market as well. There are certain podcasts that have definitely um, taken certain categories by storm, and they are now synonymous with those categories. But there is an entire ocean of categories in which you can be synonymous with that category in the location that you're sitting in. And the competition is not as much as you think it is. So yeah.
So, is it true that it's the about 30% of the podcasts globally, or the most popular podcasts, are usually comedy ones? Is that true?
So um, no. uh,
Okay.
uh, so uh, so so the interesting thing about podcast metrics again is that it's um, I don't think there's been a very strong amount of research that's been done for podcasting globally. What you're stating would probably be a very accurate figure in one part of the world, but I can tell you for the India market and the South Asian market, devotion and spirituality is the top performing media format in terms of consumption, no comparison. Then post that point is um, uh, true crime, which is globally a very popular media format. Then self development, self growth content, both occupational led, education led, as well as just common skill sets led. And then after that is romance and like eroticism kind of content. So this is the stack rank that we see here. um, and a lot of people may say that devotion based podcasts aren't very large in like markets, let's say in the United States, but one would be surprised to know that about 40% of podcasts that have been created in the United States are actually church podcasts and pastor led podcasts, in which they, and if you think about it, you'll be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, because they just, every church will record their sermons, and every church, so for a large period the industry was actually carried by churches.
Interesting. That's fascinating. And I think in the UK and Australia, it's politics, isn't it?
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me very much. Let's talk about the other popular one then as well, I guess, the Joe Rogan show. Let's talk about why that has become so popular. And that's popular relatively globally, isn't
Yes.
it?
Yes, it definitely is. I think, I mean, whether one likes Joe Rogan or not, I believe that there is a certain genius in the way that he is dealt with this show. The first thing is that I truly, tangibly believe that he actually is interested in the conversations he's having. And I truly, tangibly believe that he wants to give value back to the listeners that are watching or listening. So that's one. Um, the other thing is he's followed the golden rule of podcasting, which is consistency, both consistency in format and consistency in release schedule. And he's been doing it for a very long time without expecting an ROI. People want the Joe Rogan result, but not the 12, 14 years of taking episodes out that Joe Rogan has done on a weekly basis. And he did it because I think he did it for the right reasons. Now, in addition to that, I think there was a lot of other really wonderful things that he's done. I think he is a very um, interesting host because he allows his guests that are prowess in particular subjects to have breathing room, but he also adds his opinion. Um, and he is a relatable enough host that you almost can vicariously live through him. And I think that that is one of the fundamental cornerstones to a really strong interview led podcast. If you can feel like you're the host and you can feel like you're part of the conversation, or at the very least, a fly on the wall, you're ahead of the curve. And then finally, I think he knows his target audience. So I don't even know for a, I'm not 100% sure, but I think some of the things that he has said may not even align 100% to his belief systems. I don't know about this, but he knows that he's speaking to. This is why the acquisition of his show also happened, because he was speaking to a very specific group of people that Spotify knew if they acquired his show would move to Spotify to listen to his show. So it was worth making that investment because they were going to get a return on that investment by these many X number of subscribers that would now come into Spotify. So he specifically spoke to, and again, I may be wrong on my exact ICP or target group, but um, white, male, Western focused audiences between the ages of 25 to 50, that were interested in MMA, that demographically would have had a little more. disposable income, at their had a little bit more disposable income. And given that he knew that he was speaking to these people, when it came to Spotify making a purchase decision, Spotify immediately said, okay, how many people listen to this guy's show? If we get X number of people to come to Spotify that are very difficult to actually acquire, if we just acquire him instead, how many of them can we acquire, and how many of them can convert to becoming paying users, and how many of them will continue to stick with us? So if you just look at it from a slightly simpler business model like that, you understand the dynamics of why a Joe Rogan does well. So yeah, that's my small
Okay.
analysis of him.
Well, very in depth analysis, I would say. And I think you've got that demographic absolutely perfect there. So let's go on to the monetization then of podcasts and how people monetize from them, and what's the potential revenue one can make from podcasting should they become successful.
Um, Okay, awesome. That's another really good and important question, because a lot of creators do want to know this even before jumping in. Uh, I would say that y- so I would say that your podcast needs to have a certain amount of traction, just like anything. Um, it needs to have a certain amount of traction for you to begin monetizing. I know some edge case scenarios where people have got sponsorship deals um, before starting their podcast, but normally those people will be eminent personalities, or they must have just got lucky. So I wouldn't bank on that model. Number one, so you need to create with a certain amount of consistency, with the hope that what you're providing into the market does have value. Now, let's assume that that part of the story has taken place. Now, how many people is enough? I've seen shows where 1,000 listens or 1,000 streams or 1,000 downloads um, per episode has been monetized effectively. And I've seen shows where 25,000 downloads per episode has not been monetized effectively. And the sheer difference was the host was very clear on who they were speaking to. So, one example was a podcast that basically was speaking about the 9 months of pregnancy, and was speaking about literally every single aspect of that entire journey, from what you should eat to how what you should wear to, like certain precautions you should take, to classes you can join, basically very ROI driven. Now you're already limiting yourself to a smaller universe of people that can listen to this, but the people that will listen to this to a very large degree are going to be people that are either very close to somebody that's pregnant, or they are pregnant themselves. So if I go to a brand and tell a brand that I have, 1,000 women or 1,000 people that are connected to women that are in their 9 months of pregnancy, and you're running a parent, like you're running a parental magazine, or you're running a like a, a, a store for strollers, this is a very exciting transaction for me to actually partake in. And I've seen this brand actually do season one with the sponsor, season two with the sponsors, season three with the sponsor, and their numbers have not grown that's substantially. What they made sure to do is, once people actually start listening to their podcast, they make their power users convert and join a community, and then those people in that community tend to help women that are now in their pregnancy. So the people that started listening in season one and are still listening in season three are in that community now, helping the people that are listening for the first time in season three. On the other hand, I've seen a podcast with 25,000 downloads per episode, and they were speaking about everything under the sun. One episode about astronomy, one episode about astrology, one episode about, dogs, one episode about computers. So they had a huge, you know following and like base, but anytime they went to a brand was essentially asking them, so what am I going to get? I don't understand. Like, it's phenomenal for you from a personal branding perspective, but where is this going for me? So um, so I think that's a very important distinction that people need to make of, like, how many is enough is a question people often ask, but I will also ask back, who are the people in that pool? And then how you make money is a myriad of different ways. There are direct monetization avenues and indirect monetization avenues. Direct monetization avenues include things that the hosting platform can provide to you, so things like advertising, which also breaks up into something called dynamic ad insertion and programmatic ads. No need to get into the semantics of it, but simply put, one is manual, so adding manual ads where you can earn a slightly higher amount, and one is programmatic ads where you can be slightly lazier. The other way is you can lock your content behind a paywall, and this is colloquially called a private podcast. So let's say you're creating content that's very valuable for people. Your season two or certain episodes can be behind a paywall, and you can use platforms like Patreon, or if the hosting provider that you're working with is offering private podcasts, you can use that as well. um, a lot of people also use private podcasts just to get email addresses and just to build nurture sequences. Another one is, you can take patronage, and you're actually looking at podcasters that make six figures in dollar amounts on pure patronage from people that want them to continue their podcast.
Wow.
Then there are indirect methods. So indirect methods are like affiliate marketing. So you add affiliate links, and generally the trust with podcasting is a lot higher. So people tend to want to listen to the host and actually believe in what the host is saying. So they will tend to click on those links. Merchandising is really big, especially if you're doing a pop culture related podcast. So let's say I'm doing a podcast about punk rock, and I'm speaking to specifically people that are, fans of punk rock. I can tie up with the merchandising company, have no overhead cost on my own, and every time somebody makes an order, it's almost like a drop shipping system where the T-shirt is printed with my merchandising partner, and it reaches my customer directly, without me participating in this confusing process at all. And then tours. So a lot of podcasters are actually doing both virtual tours, and they're doing physical tours. That's happening more in the West.
Wow. Should we get a t-shirt with your and my face on it then? And then we can have that as our merch for this
Yeah.
podcast. I think that's a winner. Absolutely. Wow, that's such interesting information. Let's talk about consumption now then, if we can. What's interesting and fascinating to me is the fact that someone like you and millions of other people listen to podcast after podcast after podcast throughout their working day sometimes. You know, I've spoken to people who are creatives and they're working on things, for example, and they're able to consume podcast after podcast, and you in your banking job were able to do that as well. How much of those podcasts do we actually absorb when we're listening to them and doing something else?
So they say that you have about 70% more memory and coding when you're listening to content, because it operates more like something called theater of the mind, where you're imagining the story while somebody else is orating it. You tend to have much higher levels of um, you know emotional connection with the person that's speaking. And a great way to test this is if you close your eyes and think about when you used to listen to the radio as a child, there'd probably be a voice even till today that you'll remember, and you'll probably remember their name, and you'll probably remember a feeling that you have in association to that person. I know I do. Um, and uh, I I would actually state that, like, how much of it you're absorbing, maybe that can depend on you as a person, but I think subconsciously it definitely affects you in very strong ways. That's why a lot of people are always talking about video podcast versus audio podcast. I think video podcasts are phenomenal because they are very good for sort of awareness, and being top of mind, and top of funnel, sort of activities, because they are also, but the negative side of it is that they are more short term memory led. So you'll watch a video and then you may forget it. You'll watch a reel and then you may forget it. A podcast, on the other hand, like a voice that, or something that you have an association with, um, is the is something that you can nest or rest in your long term memory. And if a podcaster can manage to get and fit themselves in a particular habit of somebody's day, they are sorted, because the people, almost like Pavlov's dog, will start to associate that habit with that person. So I've seen really successful podcasters that will actually mention the habit, during the start of their podcast, and they'll say, "I hope you had a great day at work today, and I hope your ride home currently isn't going too rough." And when you initially hear this, you're like, "But I'm sitting at my desk. I'm not driving back home." But there's genius in that, because this person is actually pushing you towards listening at that particular period. And over time, the hope is that you start associating your drive back home with that person. I think that's genius. Like, if there's no better type of association that you can get.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting how you compared it to Pavlov's dogs there, because I imagine that if I listened to a podcast and someone said that a few times, that I would think, right, okay, oh gosh, I better put that podcast on.
Yeah.
It's that time of day
Yeah.
again. So, as you can probably tell, Gautam, I'm a pretty visual person, and I've recorded some podcasts in a beautiful studio in Dubai, and I've done it in London as well. And that's actually how we met, through the studio in Dubai. And from a creator's perspective, and especially being a coach like I am, I actually prefer doing them in a studio. When I'm next to the person, I can see their reactions and we can have a natural conversation. I can't tell you how stressed I am producing podcasts online like this, because you're not only having a conversation with someone, but you're trying to control all the technology side of things as well. And for me as a coach and any kind of host as well, is I want to be focused on you. I want to be focused and listening on what you're saying, what you're delivering, so I can really actively listen and answer. I don't want to be thinking about adjusting the sound volumes. I don't want to be thinking about, the light is fading or my microphone's not working, for example. So I think for me as a creator, that beautiful studio space lends itself to what I do. But what I'm trying to do as well is my podcasts are on Spotify, they are on Apple as well. Is that the best way to approach it if you feel more comfortable doing it in a studio?
Yeah, 100%. I think whatever you need to do to feel confident and feel comfortable, you should do, because it comes out in the conversation that you're having. And the beauty of the audio side is it can just be stripped from the video and be repurposed and be placed in audio platforms. Um, I think if wearing a hat is something that gives you comfort and makes you feel like you're in your element, you should. I actually truly believe that a large number of people buy specific microphones today, not because of audio quality. I think that people buy microphones today because it gives them a sense of comfort. It gives them a sense of like, okay, I'm a serious podcast. I'm creating something good. I'm putting in my effort. I'm putting in my energy. And that's okay. That's also why a lot of us dress up. If I today walked into a meeting, and in the meeting I was wearing I was I was wearing my night suit, I wouldn't feel confident to conduct myself in that meeting. And this is a personal, maybe other people would, but I wouldn't feel comfortable conducting myself in that meeting appropriately, I wouldn't feel confident. So I dress up a particular way when I go to work because that puts me in the zone that allows me to, take the day by its horns. And a podcast is no different. So uh, once the podcast is done, all you need to do is remove the MP3 from the MP4, which is nothing, and maybe do a couple of edits on it to make it more like audio friendly. And this is so I'll tell you what to keep in mind, just so that, because as I've stated, do whatever makes you feel comfortable. But what to keep in mind is, if you in your podcast, let's say video podcast, gesticulate a lot, or if you're pointing at something, or if you're like, oh, look at that, that unfortunately puts a um, lot of listeners off, because the listeners immediately like made aware of the fact that this podcast is not meant for listening. So one of the things that you can do in your scripting or when you're talking is be empathetic to the listener, because they could also be listening to this. So don't point at specific things, or like say, oh, do you see this thing on the wall right here in front of me, etc., etc. That, sort of breaks the connection. And the second thing is, when you're doing your distribution, as you said, Spotify, Apple, I would make sure, because you're also sitting in the like a part of your audience will be folks from the Middle East as well, right? I'm assuming.
Yes.
So there are platforms specifically in the Middle East, like Angami, where your podcast should be. There are platforms in the rest of Asia where your podcast should be. There are so many people that could be listening to your podcast right now without any extra effort from your end, but you're not necessarily leveraging that. And I'm speaking about you as a placeholder for so many hundreds of thousands of podcasters that I actually think aren't considering this.
Interesting. So that's step number one. I will be doing that from tomorrow onwards. I have to ask about accents then. I'm told that I have a strong accent. I don't hear my accents myself. Now, when it comes to podcasting, does the tone of voice, your accents, how you deliver your words, does that all have an impact on the success of it?
Oh no.
Can I be a hit in India, Gautam?
I think you can definitely be a hit in India. And unfortunately, if accents are what people judge podcasts on the basis of, then I'm screwed. Because I I think I think when God was doling out accents to different parts of the world, I don't think he was too kind with the Indian accent. So so I really hope not. I truly hope that accents don't play a very large role. I think it's still part of your personality though. So if you got a specific accent and it's quirky, like, own it. Uh, the last thing one needs is another generic sounding podcast. Goodness gracious.
Okay, I'll keep my accent for now then.
Oh, you
Thank
got a
you.
wonderful.
And I absolutely love yours as
Oh,
well.
thank you so much.
So let's talk a little bit about Hubhopper now, then, the company that you've masterminded. Tell me exactly what it is and what it does.
So Hubhopper is South Asia's largest podcast hosting and distribution platform. So, very simply put, think about all the software that you need with regards to your podcast uh, under one roof. That's pretty much what a platform like Hubhopper does. So your podcast will be housed and uh, uh, essentially exist on a platform like Hubhopper. It will be distributed from Hubhopper to various different platforms, both the large global ones as well as more nuanced platforms. You'll get your analytics and consumption patterns on the platform. You'll be able to create social collateral for your podcasts through the platform itself. You'll be able to uh, leverage embedded players, so that if you have a website, you can take those embedded players and put them on your website, and people can listen to your podcast on your own website. Or if you don't have a website, the platform will make a website for you without you having to code for your podcast. If you are a team, you can manage multiple different roles within that team on the platform itself. And if you want to make edits for your show, you can do that inside the platform as well. You can record inside the platform as well. So um, the main objective is to defragment the space on the one side, and make sure that creators don't feel an overburden of software, and that they can go to one place and feel like, okay, this place has most of the things that they need sorted. And also to try and maximize their exposure so that they get distributed into as many avenues as possible.
Wow, wonderful. But I have to ask at this point, how did you go from that person working in a room alone, listening to podcasts and being obsessed with them, to doing this? Where was the jump?
So the jump was, when you do something for 14 hours a day, then you kind of start to get curious about it. So I was very perplexed by the medium, and I didn't understand why more people didn't know about it. So I started to do a little bit of research, and initially my research was trying to see from a pessimistic standpoint what was stopping this space from growing. Um, and I happen to find and stumble upon what makes podcasting do well generally across the world. So these are variables that doesn't matter where they exist. If they exist, podcasting will do well. So the variables tend to be wherever commuting time was high, podcasting would do well. Wherever people spent a large amount of time at home, podcasting did well. Wherever data was cheap, podcasting did well. Wherever lots of languages were spoken and dialects were spoken in one location, podcasting did well. And then when I superimposed that onto the India market, I found that India was either number two or number three globally in all of these different metrics. um, Number two in terms of commuting time, number three in terms of time spent at home, cheapest country for data that year, um, more languages than most, if not every other country in the world. So I knew that it was just a matter of time that the medium would be picked up in the country, and somebody had to be a torchbearer for the medium for that to happen. And that mission felt a lot more worthwhile to me than what I was doing at the bank. So I left, and I think stumbling and fumbling and little by little and day by day, hitting different roadblocks and walls, understood what the market needed, and still understanding what the market needs. And it's been a wonderful experience sort of building up from there. So, yeah, that's kind of the journey.
Fantastic and huge congratulations with what you're doing as well. And in my introduction, I said that, the success of Hubhopper is thanks to the creators and the people that use your platform as well. At the moment, how diverse are the creators that you have at Hubhopper or using
Awesome
Hubhopper?
question. So, we have about north of 30,000 podcasts that have been distributed from Hubhopper. And that correlates to about 250 or 1,000 episodes that have gone out from Hubhopper. And the languages are north of 22 in my last count. And that actually makes me very happy to see the languages and the breadth and width of languages that people are using the platform for. um, because you also then realize that you need to make sure that the platform itself isn't restrictive to uh, you know people that only specifically understand English. So when you're also kind of designing the platform, you need it. This is kind of really exciting, but also really hard, which is how do you make something via symbolism intuitive enough that even if somebody is not being able to read what's being written, they're being able to understand how to navigate through. And that's one of the really fun things for us. We've even uh, been fortunate enough to have certain visually impaired uh, people use Hubhopper as a platform to record their podcasts and give us their feedback in terms of um, how sort of intuitive and easy it is using the softwares that they need to use to access platforms. So it's a lot of really interesting information for us.
That's wonderful. And then in terms of AI, because I have to
Mm.
ask, how is the role of AI playing its part in Hubhopper and its future?
I think a lot of people view AI from a very sort of fearful lens, which is understandable because it's something new. I think AI I constantly make this correlation. I see AI much like a calculator, and what a calculator did way back when it was introduced. It didn't make mathematicians obsolete. It didn't make anybody obsolete. It just made accountants faster, mathematicians faster. It made normal people a lot more efficient and quicker at what they were doing. So if you see AI as something that is there for efficiency and not replacement, I think it'll hold you in very strong stead. So if you need a helping hand with like your scripting, for example, or the outlining of your show, that's where AI can play a role. If you need help with, adding things like chapter markers, if you need help with show notes, if you need help with SEO appropriate title, if you need help with, creating some social collateral, anything that was time consuming for you, um, I think that is where AI can come and reduce that time. So a good exercise that I do tell people when a lot of people are like, okay, there's a lot of AI stuff to do, where I normally tend to ask podcasters, in your creation flow, what tends to take you the most amount of time and what is the thing that you find most cumbersome? Try and leverage AI in that specific thing, but make sure not to add AI in every aspect because it will show in your in the final sort of draft of your episode. It will look inundated with AI. And a lot of people are thinking about actually taking, like AI based voices and making podcasts. The very nature and reason for why podcasts exist is for connection. So if you do that, I think you're taking away the very soul of podcasts. So I would say do everything with AI, it's fine. Don't replace the speaking aspect and the connection aspect. AI is too perfect. It's not natural enough for you to feel the emotion that would come out of an imperfect person.
Absolutely, and I love that comparison to the calculator. I think that's the simplest way anyone's ever explained it. So I absolutely love that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So my key take homes from our conversation together today then is that podcasts, there's still a market for them. People are consuming them, and they're consuming them in vast amounts as well. That there are platforms that potential creators could tap
Mhm.
into that they haven't even potentially heard of as yet, and that consistency is an absolute must when it comes to creation. Am I right in all of that?
100%.
Fantastic. So, what's next for you, Gautam? What is the rest of this year looking like for you, and then beyond as well, when it comes to yourself and to Hubhopper?
No, that's a really good question. I think for us, what we want to try to do is um, take Hubhopper to more emerging markets that need the software to enable and democratize creation. That's one. Second thing is to continue to rinse and repeat by understanding what the problem statements are in the market and try and build simplistic tools that people can adopt without feeling like they need a degree to adopt them. specific, like, um, and it's not actually like the audience is always speaking to you. The audience is always either saying that, listen, I need help with discoverability. I need help with understanding what my analytics mean. I need help with monetization. I need help with, defragmentation. So they're always saying this stuff. Now it's up to us to keep trying our hand at, um, different ways of solving those problems and seeing which one sticks. So that's how I think we are looking at the rest of this year. And yeah, always trying to, I would say, push forward the agenda of podcasts, which we literally have the Hubhopper Podcast Awards going out, and they're open for submissions. And this is something that we don't benefit out of in any way, shape, or form. We just like to, sort of propel the creators that are doing wonderful work. So anybody can submit their podcast, and we have a wonderful list of judges that will judge your show as well. And creators need recognition, and oftentimes creators feel isolated and alone when they're creating. So this is a time of the year where I actually really enjoy it. Sort of enjoy interacting with the community. So that's what we're looking forward to, I guess.
Fantastic. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation together today. There's absolutely no wonder they call you the Podfather, because you are a wealth of knowledge. I don't know many people who can remember that many statistics, but I think it's clear, and it's testaments to how much you believe and how much you really, really enjoy the world of podcasting as well. So thank you so much for being such an amazing guest
Thank,
on Coaching Conversations.
thank you. Thank
And thank you. I'm Elaine Mai. This has been Coaching Conversations. All the details for Gautam the Podfather will be below in the description. Thanks so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share as well. Thanks a lot. Bye.